Your use of force in defense of others is not being evaluated by some kind of legal computer algorithm that makes perfect decisions. Most self-defense laws in the US statutes are pretty good, and the defense of others statutes are pretty good as well because they largely parallel. But these things are not applied by computers. They're applied by very imperfect people within the construct of a criminal justice system that's not well suited to dealing with normal law-abiding people who suddenly find themselves facing criminal liability. When you think of the phrase criminal justice system, the most operative word is criminal. It's a system designed to process criminals. It doesn't do well with law-abiding people. It's not used to that. They're a small minority of the people who are fed into the system. The next most operative word of criminal justice system is that it's a system. It's a machine. It's like a steam era machine, big, giant gears. It is impersonal. It does not care about you. It does not care about your truth or your reality or your feelings or the consequences for you on any kind of personal level. And the last, least most operative word is justice. And what that word means in the context of the criminal justice system is not fairness. It doesn't mean you're getting the right outcome. It means ideally that this steam era machine designed for criminals is going to deal with you in essentially the same way that it deals with everyone else fed into the system, most of whom are criminals. To a lot of law-abiding people, that doesn't feel much like what they think of as justice. But that's what it means in this context. So that's one concern. The other concern of this system, as imperfect as it is run by imperfect people, none of whom know what actually happened in your case when you came to the defense of that other person. They were not there. Nobody who's judging your use of force afterwards, in perfect 2020 hindsight, perfect safety, knows what actually happened because they weren't present. The cops who show up, they weren't standing there when you had to use force or decided to use force in defense of another person. The prosecutor who's evaluating that investigative report, he wasn't there. He didn't see what happened personally. The judge certainly didn't see what happened. He was playing golf someplace. The jury knows the least of anybody. Ideally, they're a blank slate. They're specifically screened to make sure they don't have any prior knowledge of what happened. And these are the people that are deciding your fate, your legal fate, which could potentially be the rest of your life in a cage. And none of them knows what happened in any absolute sense. Indeed, even if there were witnesses there, I would suggest that even eyewitnesses don't really know what happened in an absolute sense. We all know that if you take 5 eyewitnesses to an event and you separate them and you ask them what happened, you get 5 variations of the story, not the identical story. So there is no absolute truth in evaluating a use of force event afterward. Even you, by the way, probably don't know what happened in any absolute sense. For many years, I was teaching traveling law of self-defense classes on weekends all over the country, 40, 45 weekends a year traveling. And I would often bring with me a very high-end self-defense simulator system. So this was came in a giant Pelican box with a projector for a screen and fancy sensors and pretend pistols that would fire an invisible infrared beam. And the student would put on this pretend pistol with a holster, and we would project a threat scenario on the screen, completely artificial threat scenario. And all the other students in the class are watching. And typically we would run students through this after an entire day of law of self-defense instruction. So all day they've been listening to me talk about the legal boundaries for the use of force in self-defense, about as well informed as people could possibly be. And then we would put them into the simulator environment one at a time with all the other students watching. We would project a pretend threat on the screen, and they would have to solve the problem using verbal commands. We even had a little infrared pepper spray canister they could use if they chose. Of course, they had the pistol to go to if they wanted to. And these little videos would have some character on the screen doing something that may or may not be dangerous, and they had to solve the problem. And then after they solved the problem, after these videos are short, 60 seconds, 90 seconds might have been the longest one. After they solved the problem on the screen, they would turn their back to the screen and have to explain to the rest of the class what they saw, what they did, why they did it. What was their legal rationale for whatever their use of force decision making was. And folks, a lot of these people couldn't articulate what they saw. They couldn't remember what they saw. Either they missed really important things, they didn't see them, or they saw things that were not there. Especially, by the way, if I were to suggest that things were there. They'd go, oh, I'd say, what color was the guy's hat? And they say, oh, it was red. And there was no hat. And it's not because they're lying. It's because the way the brain captures and stores and recalls information under stress is completely different than our own experience. And these people were under stress. You'd think, how could they be under stress? It's like a video game they're playing. But they were. It's hard to know if it was because they wanted to make the right decisions and not embarrass themselves in front of class. Your hits were scored, by the way, with this machine. So, if you had a bunch of misses, everybody saw it. We all saw that you didn't actually know how to run that gun, that pretend gun. But when they were done, you could see their respiration was up. Their hands were shaking. Sometimes they were sweating, stammering. So they couldn't remember what they saw. Often they couldn't remember what they did. They wouldn't remember doing things we all watched them do. Or if they did remember what they did, they wouldn't remember the timing or the sequence correctly. And then, of course, if you can't remember what you saw and you can't remember what you did, it's kind of hard to explain all of that within a sound legal rationale. So I mention all this because even you acting in self-defense, if these people were experiencing that level of debilitating cognitive stress in a completely safe environment, completely artificial threat, how do you think your mind's working, facing a genuine threat, either to yourself or to some other person? So even you don't really know what happened in an absolute sense. You won't remember correctly how many shots you fired, who else was around, what color the guy's shirt was. There's lots of stuff you won't remember. Or if you do remember it, you're going to remember it differently the minute after the event, the hour after the event, 12 hours after the event, 24 hours after the event. As the brain chemistry changes and settles, your brain's going to recall the information in different ways, not because you're lying, just because that's the way cognition works under stress. So all of this is to say that nobody knows what happened in an absolute sense. So no one's looking for that. The court's not looking for that. The cops aren't looking for absolute perfect knowledge of your use of force event. The prosecutor's not, the judge isn't, the jury isn't. They're looking for what's good enough knowledge of what happened for their purpose. That could well be wrong. But that's what they're going to go with, because everyone knows perfection's not attainable in understanding your use of force event. That applies to if you defend yourself, and it applies to if you defend other people. And because of this ambiguity about the facts and the reality, there's often plenty of room for a prosecutor who's intent on characterizing your use of force in defense of yourself or others in a negative way to have room to do that.